We may still have the big house left on the horizon, but one ranking conversation in the Melee community can already be put to rest. Hungrybox is Melee's best player for a third year in a row. And as much as this may be a hard pill to swallow for fans of the other players around Hbox's level, hopefully I'll be able to convince you of Hungrybox's claim to the throne for this year even before Big House happens. I'm always down to hear a new perspective though, so be sure to give your detailed explanation down in the comments if I haven't convinced you by the end of the video. But let's get into this actual discussion by talking about attendance, which provides an important piece of context. For this video, we're going to be focusing on how these top 5 players' years relate to Hbox's. And by significant attendance wise, Hbox has been out to more events than every other player in the top 6 besides Zane, whose 14 events attended beats out his 12 events attended by 2. Rewarding attendance is an important factor when putting together a ranking in Melee. If players aren't rewarded for putting themselves out there to potentially drop sets at events, a player could perform well at a handful of events earlier in the year and then skip out on later events to preserve their greater head-to-head records. The notable exception to this is players from regions outside the US, as the time and monetary commitment the travel out to events can be an exceptional strain even for players at the highest level of the game. So generally more lenience is, in my opinion should be, given to players based outside of the US. So circling back to this list in Hbox, what I'm trying to express isn't that points should be flatly given to players who are able to drop more money and attend more events. What is being said is that choosing to put themselves more at risk to pick up bad losses is a context that should be kept in mind when discussing other factors of their resume, such as head-to-head records. A great way to see how these two factors cross in a rough manner is how many total sets these 8 have played against each other this year. In this regard, Hbox sits atop the mountain with 34 total sets, with Zane at 24 and Axe in 21st being 2nd and 3rd respectively. But let's move away from the grander picture for a second and single in on head-to-heads. We can quickly cut Zane, Plup, and Amza out of this conversation with how poor their spreads are at this level of the game. Mango's slightly closer to the rest of the pack, but being the only one with 3 strong losing records cuts him out of the conversation for having the best spread, but does put him in a group above the other 3. Then for these final 4, let's try to express these numbers in words. Hungrybox will generally lose to Wizrobe and Leffen if he meets them in bracket. Hungrybox will be generally expected to win if he faces Axe, Mango, Zane, or Plup. And to simplify it immensely like all of this is doing, it's about a coin flip for who wins when Hbox faces Hamza. Wizrobe will then generally lose to Axe, and I think it's very fair to say based on Wizrobe's 0-16 lifetime record against him that he's expected to lose to Mango as well. Wizzy is then expected to beat Hbox, Leffen, Zane, and Amza. This is again super oversimplified, but we'll touch on that in a second. And finally, he's expected to trade sets with Plup. I think you generally get my point, so we're not going to waste time by going through all 4 players. So then who has the best head-to-head spread in this group of players? It's a surprisingly tricky question that can depend heavily on how you want to approach it. Is it the players that have shown they can turn their losing records around by picking up a set this year? Is it the player who has the losing records against the best pair of players? Is it the players that have the strongest overall win rate across these 4 players? For me, I like to think about it as how many hard roadblocks in bracket that each player has had at this level, as the question for the ballot is, a tournament is held every weekend during the ranking period, and all the players on the list are able to attend every event. Over the course of the season, who performs best? So Hungrybox has no hard roadblocks, as he has shown that he does have it in him to beat Wizrobe, Leffen, and Amza. And then Wizrobe, Axe, and Leffen all have one hard roadblock each, if you're willing to seed Mango as Wizrobe's hard block as we discussed earlier. Which brings us back around to the question that I avoided earlier. Who has the best head-to-head spread at this level? Honestly, I think there's a case for all these guys depending on how you choose to argue it, but personally Hbox and Axe sit at the top for me because they've been able to hold pretty solid records while attending more events than Leffen and Wizrobe combined. For me at this level, it's probably Axe slightly above Hbox with a big gap than Leffen and Wizzy at 3rd and 4th respectively. But despite all the time we just spent breaking down head-to-heads at the highest level, they aren't the only thing to be kept in mind when looking at rankings. We also need to look at how these players perform against all the players they face, not the top 6 or top 8. Because how well a player performs against the field determines how far they're able to get into bracket. And how far they get into bracket goes back to the question that's being asked for the ballot. I'm going to take a brief detour right here and briefly touch on some concerns based on this topic that Amza brought up on Twitter. He said, and I quote, "I don't like current ranking systems. It seems to place much value on losing records, right? I feel like that it makes me not want to attend locals or regionals, and it looks so bad for improving our local scenes." There are essentially 2 parts of this that I want to quickly address separately. First is the concept of ranking system, which I think my fellow Melee Stats member Ambi Sinister addressed pretty well in his response by saying, quote, "There is no ranking system. There are only voters who make their list depending on whatever they value. The only constant is that every panelist gets a list of all the sets and where the sets happened. So if you don't agree with how I personally do my ballot system, it really doesn't matter because I'm a small portion of the greater community who also does ballots. There's a ton of other community members who do this thankless job who don't get paid for it that also have different views on the ranking system, so bundling them all into one group feels a little bad. A clear example of this was shown this week on the ranking show, where the Crimson Blur and I spent about 30 minutes arguing about how heavily attendance should be weighted this year and what that means for ranking Axe, Leffen, Wizrobe, and Zane. We're both informed members of the community, and we're able to come with different and both valid conclusions when presented with the same dataset. Second is placing value on losing records. Highlighting the points and frequency where a player has had missteps at an event is important, but the greater trends we can see from that is much more important in my opinion. Like say Fiction being up 17-4 this year against Army. That doesn't say to me, wow, Fiction dropped 4 sets to a player ranked lower than him, but instead it says, when Fiction and Army meet in bracket, Fiction generally wins. A more high profile example would be Zane versus Junebug and Lod. Zane and Lod have met 3 times this year, twice at the Cave Local and once at Super Smash Con. At one of the Cave events, Zane traded sets with Lod, and when they met at Super Smash Con, Zane won 3-1. So obviously that set at a major weighs so much more and shows me that Zane can beat Lod. So locals aren't completely worthless when determining someone's ranking, but obviously they matter a whole lot less more than sets at majors. Everything just all comes down to context, which can vary wildly from set to set, player to player, and situation to situation. So I hope this helps address and alleviate the concerns that Amza was addressing in his tweet. So with all that under consideration, let's talk about these 6 players' worst losses. Hungrybox's losses outside the top 8 came against IBDW at Summit, who he's 2-1 against for the year, and Albert at Low Tier City, who he beat later at the event. HBox's overall record against IBDW and his win later at Low Tier City does not completely absolve him of those 2 losses, but it's important to keep this context in mind, as we will with players in the future. Across the 4 events Wizrobe has shown up to, he dropped a set to 2 separate Falcon players, which gives the impression that he may have an issue in the Ditto. These are the only 2 sets he's played against both of these players this year, and he's up 2-0 on None, but they haven't played since Smash and Splash before None had returned to his top 20 form. Axe has the largest list by a long mile of any of these players. Although he looks like he finally has been able to clean up his Ices problem by beating Army at main stage, it doesn't forgive dropping sets to 4 separate Ices players throughout the year. And on top of that, he's got losses to S2J's Falcon and Swedish's and Face Roll Sheik, which does call into concern his consistency despite his great head-to-heads at the highest level. Leffen has really only had one bad event, Shine 2019, but when you have only 5 events on your resume for the year, this means these losses count for a bit more, even if you're a non-US player. Mango had a middle-of-the-road consistency to his name that took a nosedive over the last 2 weekends when he dropped sets to Lucky, Army, and Spark. And lastly, we have Zane, whose singular cave losses to Lod and Junebug really shouldn't be held against him at all, seeing as Zane beat Lod at SmashCon, and Zane took multiple sets off June this year with his Fox. And both of his records against S2J and Triff, neither of which are exceptionally bad losses by any means, both sit at 1-1 for the year, with Zane winning the second time they met at the same event for both players. So at the bottom of the barrel here, we obviously have Axe and Mango. Axe's losses are much more of a concern to me as we see a clear trend of character issue through a large majority of his drop sets, whereas Mango appears to be more sporadic with the characters he loses to. The next has to be Wizrobe for having the same amount of losses as these other 3 guys with a much smaller sample size, as well as having them be against the same character, which is a cause for concern. And then with these final 3, I could also see them reasonably ordered in any way. If unranked losses really skeeve you away from a player, Hungrybox takes 3rd without a question. If beating a player later at the same tournament mitigates a lot of the negative side effect of a loss for you, Zane, HBox, and Leffen is the order that makes a lot of sense. But these 3 having the cleanest consistency at this level should be something that most should be able to agree upon. So bringing this all together and attempting to wrap this up in a nice clean package, how is HBox number 1 for the year without even having the results of the Big House if there's a decent amount of gray area in this discussion? Let's enter it this way. If HBox decided that he didn't want to attend any events for the rest of the year, including the Big House, is he number 1? Absolutely. I'd be hard pressed to find an argument to disprove that, because there isn't enough time or large events for anyone to be able to catch up to him. Leffen winning the Big House by beating Axe and Wizrobe would be a great accomplishment for his year. But firstly, Axe isn't going to be at the Big House 9. And on top of everything we've talked about for their head-to-heads at both levels being so close, Hungrybox would have still been to twice as many events as Leffen. And does the prestige of winning SmashCon and hypothetically winning the Big House stand up to a win at Genesis, and Pound, and CEO, and Low Tier City, and Shine, and main stage, and many other events lower than this level. Hungrybox has consistently shown up and played well at a ton of events this year, and despite what you may think about his character choice or play style, he's a damn good Melee player. So saying that this 1 out of 13 event for HBox is potentially enough to knock him from number 1 just feels incredibly wrong to me. And that about does it for this video. Sorry if this one was a bit more scatterbrained than my usual content. There's been a lot of public discussion on rankings, belts, and a lot of things based around it recently, and I've had some stuff I wanted to say, and this Hungrybox's number 1 talk felt like a great vehicle to express it through. Again, I'm not infallible, and what matters in rankings changes from person to person. So feel free to tell me what you think about this particular discussion, or anything around the topics that I hit on in this video. Just remember that saying Hungrybox isn't number 1, or yes I agree with you Save, doesn't help anyone learn more or see another perspective. Make sure to explain your stance whether you agree or disagree with me, so we can all grow as people from the discussion. And that about does it for me. I've been SaveAsUntitled, and I'll see you guys next time.